Profiles and Issues is a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. It is a show that profiles people and issues that affect the church in the modern world. Your program host is Father James Korda.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Profiles and Issues. I'm Father Jim Korda. Our issue today is Dorothy Day. To help me profile the issue is Sister McManamon. So nice to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Jim.
Why do they call Dorothy Day Servant of God?
Well, as far as the canonization process goes, that's the first step. When a bishop lifts her up and says, or someone in the church lifts her up and it's received, as far as I know, that's the title that comes before beatification. But I'm not an expert on that.
In her work, why would she be called a servant?
Well, that's a different matter entirely. I think Dorothy's life was one of servant, and I think the washing of the feet was a critical part of her thinking in terms of the gospel. And for her, she did in her mind as Jesus did. And so that servanthood was essential. And yet at the same time, I think if you watch her life very carefully and you live with her model of life, she doesn't even emphasize servant so much as walking with as a partner. And I think that's the way she lived her life after her conversion, although those elements are very present in her early life as well.
Let's talk a little bit about her early life prior to her conversion. What was she like? What got her motivated to do what she did eventually?
Well, I think in her childhood she was a spunky kid, no question about it, and a very smart girl. I think she had a very unusual religious foundation that was rather hidden. Her parents did not live a religious tradition to speak of. Rather, I think her mother has a Presbyterian background and the father had an Episcopal background, and she picked that up in her really childhood years by getting confirmed in the Episcopal Church. But it was sort of a dare thing, against the tide of what her parents were doing and what other people were doing. But then as she went through college, she was very bright, and she did get a scholarship and went to the University of Illinois in Urbana. And then I think that the outcome of that was an opportunity to move on the way her father had moved on into journalism. There were three of the children that went into journalism, perhaps because of him, more likely because of him. And she went to Columbia in New York, and she started hobnobbing with people of considerable fame in our estimation today, Eugene O'Neill, Jacques Maritain. Those were her bar friends at night. And I think what happened was she became very concerned about the tide of depression that was fast overcoming, especially the New York area. And in doing that, in becoming involved in that, she tended to join a very socialist model of life and marched for them, wrote for them, became in her own right kind of famous with them. And there are many stories about her faith, but the one that kind of attracts me and points to the conversion motion in her life is that story of her stopping in the churches in New York as she protested with the socialist movement and stopping to cool off, if you will. And in that cooling off experience was able to be really touched by the Eucharist and by a somewhat mystical experience of just sitting in contemplation, primarily to cool off, but ultimately to be transformed.
Was she transformed by someone, or was her transformation because of Christ?
Well, certainly because of Christ. And she knew more and more of that as she goes along. And as you read, especially her biographies, you know that, and that 11th Virgin holds, it's a novel, but it holds certain elements of her conversion. And certainly the long loneliness holds the depth of it. Union Square to Rome is a perfect description of her journey. But I think the people that influenced her to some extent, certainly the sisters that she met in those churches. Sister Aloysius was one of the famed people that was still living as recently as 3 or 4 years ago. And it was to Sister Aloysius that she went to ask if her child could be baptized. When Tamar was born, she decided she wanted to offer her a structure in life that she never had, and that would be a religious faith. And she, of course, was admonished for, well, you can't very well thrust religion on the child. If anybody's going to bring her up, we're not bringing her up. You're going to have to. And that's a point at which she decides that she must make that transition herself. And at the same time, she has a deep love relationship with Tamar's father. And that's the love of her life and remains the love of her life for all her years, even after her conversion and separation from him. So I think that grace, if you will, to move away from something so significant in her life because he was unwilling for any institutional religion, any government issues. So she becomes a Catholic and is radical, in my estimation, as to how she's going to live it. So it's separation from a former life that was a lot of fun and a lot of good friends, but she felt she had to go a different way.
Let's talk about that Catholic radicalism, because sometimes I get the feeling that we're very nonchalant about practicing our faith, and yet here's a woman who is really a convert to Catholicism and embraces it in a radical way that it becomes not only her way of life but her very being.
Right. I think that what I see in Dorothy and what I've read about her life and what I know, Dorothy's granddaughter has become a close friend of ours, and as a result kind of turned to her for insights and some I suppose experiences of what happened with this faith. But I think she was very taken with the Benedictine way of life. And so the rule of St. Benedict was very significant in her life. And then other religious became very significant in her life. She saw the need to be very disciplined. And I suspect she needed to be very disciplined, because if she was not, her life would explode beyond the borders. And it did explode beyond borders in the right places. But for her, it meant daily Mass, it meant the Rosary, it meant the Vespers of the Church, and that has carried on in most Catholic workhouses, where though the desire to have any faith present in the room was uppermost, it still meant that there was prayer regularly, Vespers at night, there was Mass often, sometimes every day, at least every week. Those elements of church were very important to her, as were the sacraments. And so for her not to have Eucharist each day or to have the power of Christ present in the Eucharist was a big loss. It just didn't happen.
Let's talk about the Catholic Workers' Movement now. Give us a brief history about it, how it started, and where it's at now.
Well, Dorothy converted, I think, 1927, and her child was the important thing in her life. And she was continuing, though, in her somewhat isolated life to open her doors to the poor. And just as a human story, and this is written up in many places, but it's kind of a touching one, she would open that apartment to many people, and sometimes it would be packed. Despite the baby, it was packed with people. And one evening, around 10 or 11 o'clock at night, 2 women appeared at the door. And those 2 women, of course, wanted hospitality for the night. And she said, I can't offer you anything. She said, even the bathroom has someone in it. And so they went away somewhat graciously. And the one woman reappeared maybe 4 weeks later. And Dorothy said, I'm so sorry that happened that night. She said, I felt so grieved to have turned you away. And then she followed by saying, where's your friend? And the woman said, you know, when we left here, it was probably the 18th or 20th place we had tried. And so she left here and went down into the train depot, threw herself in front of a train. And in that moment, Dorothy went through what we've called in our house a type of transfiguration and transformation. And so as a result of that experience, she takes the returns from her first book, little novel, 11th Virgin, and purchases a larger place. So there begins this dramatic intention to receive people under her own roof. But you can never talk about establishing the Catholic worker houses without speaking about Peter Morin. And Peter Morin is, of course, in history known as a Christian brother who left the Christian Brothers and became a street preacher in many ways. People chide about his constant preaching, but a man of great wisdom and had a vision. And his vision was, of course, that we would counteract the negative effects of capitalism by opening our doors, but in particular by developing, he called it his agronomic universities. In my language, it's a farm, and it's getting a commune together to both have the opportunity to work the land and to live on the land so that human dignity would be restored. So that's a big element in the development of the Catholic worker community. Together, they argued about what it should be, but the bottom line for Dorothy was that there needed to be community, there needed to be a commitment to a poverty that expressed the poverty of the poor, to live with, to partner with all the days that you were able to. And the other thing that was very important to her was the newspaper. And that goes back to her skills. You know, she was a writer and could do it.
We're going to talk more about that specifically, but we're going to take a quick break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our show. Our issue is Dorothy Day. Sister Ann, tell us a little bit about particularly your work with the Dorothy Day House locally, and let's talk about it nationally. Is it all around?
Well, the interesting thing is that the latest statistics, not that that was important to Dorothy, but it's a fact that there are about 224 houses across the world, 188 approximately in the United States. You never know, when houses emerge. Like our house was never part of a roster, and it's only 3 years old. But it's significant to see the uniqueness in each of those houses, and yet this solid and unwavering commitment to two things. One is extraordinary hospitality based on Matthew 5, Matthew 25, and the commitment to peaceful resistance to the injustices that afflict the poor. And I think that's, in the aims and means, that's a really solid for sure in every house, despite the uniqueness. And so I would go to some of the houses I've been to. There are 4 in the Akron area, for example. And those 4 houses are pretty committed to the immigrant and to feeding at lunchtime. In Iowa, the house there, been there about 30-some years, that's a house that's very committed to an evening meal. And they have 4 houses, and they are very active in peaceful resistance to issues like the drones, like Guantanamo. And they are able, because 30 years behind them, to generate an enthusiasm and an action for that. Our house is a baby in many respects. It's just 3 years old. We're just crossing the 3-year line. And building hospitality is the core of what Dorothy expected, and that out of that hospitality and that sense of community rises the desire to do more for justice. It's because you see it in front of the injustice in front of your face, that you are moved to say, I should take one more step. And so our efforts in our house have been devoted to building that hospitality and repairing a ramshackle house to begin with. And that's always a good thing, because it means volunteers include themselves in the repair, in the preparing meals, in serving. In our case, we do showers, and that's a really important thing for people who live on the street and can't possibly get a shower anywhere else. But our movement toward both residents and toward justice have been all tied up basically with the federal budget and the injustices in that budget nationally and internationally. It's been a hard piece for us because we had to learn a lot. We had to bring in a lot of speakers. We had to learn the faithful budget. When that finally arrived, that was our gift, because that faithful budget, which has been prepared by people of faith all over the country, many religious faiths, many religious communities, network in particular, once they develop that document, which really describes the budget as a moral issue, and goes into the 5 categories that we need to address in our faith commitment, that helped us a lot. And so we went out on the street then, and were able to protest every Friday in regard to that budget, produce leaflets that explained why we were concerned, what we expected. That gave people energy, but your core group in an action like that is maybe 15 at the most. But I always think of Dan Berrigan's comment after he was in social justice for all those years. He said, we started with 15, and he said, I'm proud to tell you today we're 9. And so that's that's the way you have to go. That's the faith that is called.
Now, it's been just a little over 30 years since Dorothy Day has died. What do you think she would be thinking or feeling at this point, 30 years after her death, with these wonderful things that's happening in her name?
I think it wouldn't be a matter of pride, but it would be, finally, you got the message. Because that's the way she thought about those things, that all of us should be living the gospel, and that at the moment of death, the big thing that you would want to be able to say is, I did it in your name. I got it done. And that you would find joy in it personally, and you would find union with others in a community of people that were all about the Lord in her mind.
You know, oftentimes when someone is being looked at to being beatified or canonized, we look at their life and we try to point out what exactly makes them a saint. What would make Dorothy a saint?
Oh, her faith, without question. That's the core, and you experience it. It's a 24/7 in everything that she did. And radical faith in terms of the needs of a house even, and turning to St. Joseph and saying, you find the coal for this house or else, and next day there's coal for the house, miracles that happened in her name to provide for the poor, to provide for those who came to the house. And I think she would say that having transmitted that inspiration to so many people, and to see the hunger that people have to do this, would be very fulfilling. In particular, we'll mention her granddaughter, who, several of her grandchildren are involved, but Martha Hennessy, an occupational therapist, a mother of 3, a woman who has gardened and farmed all of her life because her mother did that, I'm sure. I mean, I'm putting rationale behind that, but I'm sure that's what it is. But, I contacted her last week because I was going to do this, to ask if there was something I could say about her grandmother that maybe wasn't in my heart and head. And she was in Jordan, addressing the needs of wounded children. She's an occupational therapist by profession, and she brought that to bear. A month ago, when I contacted her, she was in Afghanistan, living with families there. That's her peaceful resistance, to be involved in being present. The personalism of the Catholic worker was critical to her. So I think that she would find great joy in the personal lives. I myself would say I've been transformed by being in the Catholic worker movement and by being in the house, but I'm transformed by the poor. I'm really touched by that experience. And I think maybe my niece said it best. Very, very bright girl, college age, and came to live there for a week. And she's done a lot of outreach work in her lifetime as a young person. But the week that she was there, 3 other women were also volunteering. And at the end of the week, we prayed, and then I said, how about giving me an insight as to what the week was like? What did the Catholic worker mean to you? And each one had a wonderful reflection. And when it came to Caitlin, she said, I learned so much. And I said, doesn't tell me a thing. What did you learn? And she said, you said that the most important part of the Catholic worker house was to break bread with the guest. And she said, all these years I've been with the soup spoon in my hand, standing and dishing out the soup. And she said, I didn't want to break bread. She said, I was probably afraid. And she said, when I sat down and I broke bread with the guests, she said, I learned more than I've learned all my life about life. And she said, I was transformed by it. And she said, so that's what I meant when I said I learned so much. She said, it just gave me a gift that will always be there. So it was the power that she was talking about, that we have power, and she felt she had power in her hand with the food. And when she sat and allowed herself to be a recipient, everything changed.
Well, when you look at some of these modern day saints that I would call them, like Dorothy or Mother Teresa, they themselves were not only changed or transformed, but what they did and passed on enabled others to be changed and transformed. And I think that's the power of the movement, so to speak.
Yes.
Isn't that the call of Catholics, to be changed and transformed? And isn't that the power of the Eucharist?
Absolutely. And I think she knew that better than most people, or maybe anyone I've ever met. It certainly was the piece of Dorothy that attracted me.
And we're coming down to the last few minutes of our time together. I wanted to see if we could focus on what else drove Dorothy. And I would venture to say that she was driven by love. How was she driven by love?
Well, I think Dorothy was a great lover all her life. That shows up in every element of her childhood. She's a passionate lover. That's the way I would put it. And in that passionate love, she could be tough. She could be really tough. But at the same time, that saved her and made her a person of force in the lives of others, and they knew it. And so, you know, I think what you said is probably the kernel of truth that causes her work to multiply, that love was there.
And I'm wondering also, in closing, if we could talk briefly about the solidarity that she had with the outcast or the homeless or those who were in particular need at that moment. And that drove her, but not out of sympathy or anything, but out of love.
Right. And one of the dear examples that touches a lot of people, you again read it in some of the literature, she was given a diamond ring to take care of the house, to buy the coal and the food and everything else. And this one woman who came every day looked at it and admired it and loved it. And third day or so, Dorothy gave it to her. Well, the whole house was in an uproar because she was giving away something that would provide for them. And they didn't feel the woman deserved it. And she said, "Why do you say that?" She said, "I gave it to her because she loved it. And I loved her by giving it to her." So that's kind of, you know, the way she was. That's the way she lived that life. It was remarkable. Even in our own house and repairing it, one woman came in and made these beautiful drapes. It's a 103-year-old house, so the windows are huge. And some of the women that came through said, "Oh my, that's too much for a poor person." And the woman who made them said, "If you were poor, wouldn't you love to have those drapes?" And so that's kind of the way Dorothy was. She challenged the status quo.
Now, in your work at the Dorothy Day House, just close briefly with what your greatest joy is and what your greatest challenge is.
The greatest joy is the guests and the gift that they bring all of us, and the humility and the faith that so many of them live by with a life that never changes. And I suppose the greatest challenge is the peace and justice, peace and getting help to deal with the perimeter things like carpentry, and you know, that's hard work. So I would say the peace and justice, though, is the biggest challenge.
Sister Ann McManamon, thank you so much for being with us and for your insights into Dorothy Day.
Thank you very much.
And have a good day, and God be with you.
Profiles and Issues was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father James Korda.